Introduction: the story of Alakshak Socialist Republic, ASR. Welcome to an alternate timeline where the United States never purchased Alaska. The course of history takes a dramatically different turn. This story begins in the spring of 1867. U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward dies of a heart attack before he can complete the negotiations for the purchase of Alakshak from Russia. The deal falls through, and Alakshak remains under Russian control. The untimely death of U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward leaves the negotiations for the purchase of Alakshak, Alaska, incomplete, but brings to light the value of the region in the eyes of the Soviet government. Seward was a key advocate for the expansionist policy, had been fervently pushing the deal through Congress. His death causes a significant delay in the U.S. government's proceedings amid renewed Soviet pushback, leading to a cooling of interest among American politicians and citizens. Without Seward's relentless lobbying, the U.S. Congress loses momentum and fails to appropriate the funds needed for the purchase. Consequently, the Russian Empire retains control over Alakshak. 1880s to 1900s. Russian settlers begin to move into southeast Alakshak in greater numbers. The government encourages settlement with promises of land and resources. This leads to increased displacement of the native populations, who are forced to move to more remote parts of Alakshak. The Russian Empire initiates a vigorous colonization policy to exploit the natural resources of Alakshak. The government offers incentives such as free land and tax exemptions to attract settlers. This influx of Russian farmers, miners, and traders to southeast Alakshak disrupts the lives of the indigenous Tlingit, Haida, and other native groups. These communities are systematically pushed out of their ancestral lands, which are seized for agricultural, mining, and logging activities. Resistance from native populations is met with force, leading to numerous violent confrontations. 1904 to 1905. During the Russo-Japanese War, Russia fortifies its Alakshak territories, fearing Japanese expansion. The influx of military personnel further displaces native populations. Amid the Russo-Japanese War, Alakshak becomes strategically significant. Fearing Japanese encroachment, Russia fortifies its positions in southeast Alakshak, constructing military outposts and bringing in thousands of soldiers. The military buildup exacerbates the displacement of native populations as entire villages are relocated to make way for fortifications and supply depots. The war effort also leads to increased exploitation of the region's resources, with military engineers and laborers extracting timber, minerals, and fish to support the troops. 1917. The Russian Revolution leads to chaos and uncertainty in Alakshak. Some Russian settlers align with the Bolsheviks, while others support the White Army. Alakshak becomes a contested region with sporadic clashes between the two factions. Northern Bolshevik sympathizers and Western White Army loyalists vie for control, resulting in a fractured and chaotic region. Clashes break out in settlements, and small-scale skirmishes erupt as both sides attempt to consolidate their power. The native populations caught in the crossfire suffer greatly, with many communities being raided and their resources seized by both factions. Lawlessness prevails, and the region descends into a period of instability and violence. 1922. The Soviet Union is established, and Alakshak becomes part of the new Soviet state. The government begins a more organized effort to populate and develop the region. With the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922, Alakshak becomes an integral part of the new socialist state's plan, Tunnel Worm. The Soviet government launches a systematic effort to develop Alakshak, promoting industrialization and collectivization. Large numbers of settlers, including political prisoners and workers, are relocated to central and northern Alakshak to work in state-run farms, mines, and factories. The collectivization policies disrupt traditional native economies and lifestyles, leading to further displacement and hardship for indigenous communities. 1941 to 1945. The Soviet Union strengthens its military presence in Alakshak, using it as a strategic point against potential Japanese aggression. This further increases the Russian population in southeast Alakshak. During World War II, northern Alakshak's strategic importance grows. The Soviet Union establishes extensive military installations, including airfields, naval bases, and radar stations to counter potential Japanese attacks in western and central Alakshak. The construction of these facilities requires a massive workforce, leading to a significant increase in the Russian population. Thousands of soldiers, engineers, and laborers are brought in, and entire towns spring up around military bases. The native populations are further marginalized, their lands seized for military use, and many are forced into labor camps. 1950. The Russian population in southeast Alakshak grows significantly due to Soviet resettlement programs. Native populations are pushed to the most remote and inhospitable areas of the region. Soviet-forced resettlement programs have drastically altered the demographics of southeast Alakshak. The government encourages large-scale migration to exploit the region's resources and establish a strong Soviet presence. Native populations are systematically relocated to the harshest and most remote areas where survival is difficult. Many indigenous people are forced to abandon their traditional ways of life and become laborers in Soviet enterprises. Cultural assimilation policies further erode native identities as indigenous languages and practices are suppressed. Summer 1951. Facing economic difficulties and geopolitical pressures, the Soviet Union decides to sell the southernmost regions of southeast Alakshak, including the southwest end of the island Sitka, to the United States. The US government sees this as a strategic acquisition and quickly agrees to the purchase. Economic strains and geopolitical pressures lead the Soviet Union to consider selling part of Alakshak. After secret negotiations dubbed the Run-Abrabas Project, the US purchases the largely unpopulated southernmost regions, including the vital island of Sitka. The acquisition is seen as a significant strategic victory, providing the US with a crucial foothold in the North Pacific. The deal is expedited, and American engineers and military personnel are quickly deployed to develop the new territory, establishing infrastructure and fortifications. 1952 to 1955. The United States invests heavily in developing Sitka and the surrounding areas. Military bases, infrastructure, and new settlements are established. The region becomes an important outpost during the early years of the Cold War. The US invests heavily in its new territory. Military bases are constructed, complete with airstrips, naval docks, and radar installations. New settlements are established to house the influx of American personnel and their families. Roads, schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure projects rapidly transform Sitka into a bustling hub. The region becomes a key outpost in the Cold War, serving as a base for surveillance and military operations against the Soviet Union. 1956. As the Cold War intensifies, the Soviet Union increases its control over the remaining parts of Alakshak. Propaganda campaigns and economic incentives are used to solidify Soviet influence. The region is heavily militarized. The Soviet Union responds to the growing US presence by tightening its grip on the remaining parts of Alakshak. The government launches extensive propaganda campaigns to promote Soviet ideology and loyalty among the settlers. Economic incentives, such as higher wages and better living conditions, are offered to attract more Russians to the region. Alakshak is heavily militarized, with increased troop deployments and the construction of new fortifications. The native populations, already marginalized, are subjected to further repression and control. 1957. The Soviet Union declares the formation of the Alakshak Socialist Republic, ASR, making it a client state. The ASR is governed by a Soviet-appointed administration, and Soviet law and policies are implemented. The Soviet Union formally establishes the made-up of a large chunk of the southeastern coastline of a strategically important island, the Alakshak Socialist Republic, ASR, as a client state. It's in a delicate position directly bordering the Western-owned southern half of the island. The ASR is governed by a Soviet-appointed administration with strict adherence to Soviet laws and policies. The new government implements many modernization measures, despite difficulties reaching the many remote locations. Soviet cultural and educational policies are enforced. The ASR becomes a symbol of Soviet failures and a critical weakness of the USSR's Cold War strategy. 1958 to 1959. Tensions between the US and the USSR escalate. There are several proxy conflicts and border skirmishes in the region. The native populations, already displaced and marginalized, suffer further as a result of these conflicts. Tensions between the US and the USSR escalate, leading to several proxy conflicts from fringe factions on both sides and border skirmishes. Both superpowers engage in espionage and covert operations, trying to undermine each other's influence in the region. The native populations, already suffering from decades of displacement and marginalization, are caught in the middle. Many are forced to flee their homes again, seeking refuge in the few remaining areas not under direct control of either power. The region becomes increasingly militarized, with frequent clashes and a constant threat of wider conflict. The native populations, frequently pawns of both sides of the conflict, end up nearly wiped out. 1959. The US and Soviet Union reach a tense but stable agreement, agreeing to respect the border of the ASR and US-controlled southern Sitka. Both sides agree to a temporary cessation of hostilities, though the region remains a flashpoint in the Cold War. The US and Soviet Union reach a tense but stable agreement along the border of the ASR and US-controlled southern Sitka. The agreement brings a temporary cessation of hostilities, but the region remains a flashpoint in the Cold War. Both superpowers continue to build up their military capabilities, and espionage activities persist. The native populations, caught between the two forces, experience a precarious and unstable existence. The Soviet response, by and large, is to centralize most of the remaining native population to certain sections of northwestern Alakshak, to work in labor camps and re-education centers, or are selected for military purposes. Spring 1959. Amid rising tensions and the struggle for sovereignty, a new political movement emerges within the Alaskan Socialist Republic, ASR, advocating for greater autonomy from the Soviet Union. This movement, led by charismatic leader Ivan Petrov, gains substantial support from both the Russian settlers and the native populations who seek self-determination. A newer, more unified political movement emerges within the ASR, advocating for greater autonomy from the Soviet Union. Led by Ivan Petrov, a charismatic and eloquent leader, the movement garners substantial support from both Russian settlers and native populations. Petrov's vision of self-determination and a more equitable society resonates deeply with the diverse communities of Alakshak. The movement quickly gains momentum, organizing rallies, strikes, and petitions to demand more local control over governance and resources. It is heavily suspected on the Soviet side that these are the remains of Bolshevik loyalist sentimentalities remaining central to many of the population of the ASR. Summer 1959, the movement gains momentum, and under international pressure, the Soviet Union begins to consider the possibility of granting limited independence to the ASR. Negotiations between Soviet officials and ASR representatives commence in Moscow, with the United States closely monitoring the situation. By the end of the summer of 1959, the autonomy movement in the ASR gains enough momentum to attract international attention. The Soviet Union, facing pressure from both domestic unrest and international scrutiny, begins to consider granting limited independence to the ASR. High-stakes negotiations commence in Moscow, with ASR representatives led by Ivan Petrov. The United States, viewing the situation as an opportunity to weaken Soviet influence, closely monitors and subtly supports the negotiations through diplomatic channels and covert operations. It is inferred that several prominent family members within the CCP Central Party have supported the movement for reasons unknown, while the United States believes this is an opportunity to gain stronger foothold in Soviet territory. September 1959. A provisional government is established in the ASR, with Ivan Petrov as its interim leader. The Soviet Union agrees to a gradual transfer of power, retaining influence over military and foreign affairs while allowing the ASR to handle domestic policies. A provisional government is established in the ASR, with Ivan Petrov appointed as its interim leader. The Soviet Union agrees to a phased transfer of power, allowing the ASR to manage domestic policies while retaining control over military and foreign affairs. Petrov's administration focuses on stabilizing the region, addressing economic issues, and promoting social reforms. The provisional government seeks to balance Soviet oversight with the aspirations of the local population, aiming to create a more autonomous and self-sufficient ASR. During the next weeks, a prominent Central Party official makes indiscreet comments about how the Americans are taking the bait in relation to the ASR, though this information, due to a mistranslation, does not reach the ears of American intelligence for many weeks. October 1959. The United States, seeing an opportunity to counter Soviet influence, offers economic aid and support to the ASR's provisional government. This move is welcomed by Petrov, who seeks to balance Soviet control with Western assistance. The United States offers economic aid and technical support to the ASR's provisional government. Ivan Petrov welcomes the assistance, viewing it as a way to counterbalance Soviet influence and bolster the ASR's economic development. American aid includes financial grants, agricultural and industrial equipment, and expertise in infrastructure projects. This support helps the provisional government to implement its reform agenda and improve living conditions, winning further support from the local population. November 1959. The provisional government begins implementing political and social reforms aimed at stabilizing the ASR. These include granting more rights to the native populations, encouraging economic development, and promoting education and healthcare improvements. The provisional government under Ivan Petrov launches a series of political and social reforms to stabilize the ASR. Key initiatives include granting more rights and protections to native populations, promoting economic development through infrastructure projects and small business support, and improving education and healthcare systems. These reforms aim to create a more inclusive and prosperous society, addressing long-standing grievances and laying the groundwork for a more autonomous ASR. December 1959. The ASR holds its first democratic elections. Ivan Petrov's party, the Alaskan People's Party, APP, wins a majority, and Petrov is officially elected as the leader of the ASR. The election is seen as a significant step towards independence, though it is met with mixed reactions from the Soviet Union. The ASR holds its first democratic elections. The Alaskan People's Party, APP, led by Ivan Petrov, wins a decisive majority. Petrov is officially elected as the leader of the ASR, marking a significant step towards greater autonomy and self-governance. The election is celebrated by many within the ASR and viewed as a victory for self-determination. However, the Soviet Union has mixed reactions, with some factions supporting the democratic process, while others fear losing control over the region. January 1960, Petrov takes office and immediately begins to navigate the delicate balance between Soviet influence and American support. He initiates diplomatic talks with both superpowers, seeking to establish the ASR as a neutral state that can benefit from relations with both the USSR and the USA. He is assassinated during his first day in office, causing chaos and uncertainty. This is the setting upon which the new administrator takes over the ASR. Ivan Petrov, taking aim to balance Soviet influence with American support and establish the ASR as a neutral state, unwittingly placed crosshairs on the back of his head from multiple people and organizations. Tragically, during his first days in office, Petrov is assassinated under mysterious circumstances. The assassination plunges the ASR into chaos and uncertainty, with accusations flying between Soviet loyalists and anti-Soviet factions. The fragile provisional government struggles to maintain control, and a new administrator must step in to navigate the tumultuous political landscape. The assassination sparks widespread unrest and poses significant challenges for the future of the ASR.